This is the Bible Book Club.
And we're in the book of Numbers.
Welcome to the club. Last episode, we covered a lot of chapters.
You read a lot.
27 through 29. First, Zelophehad's daughter took a stand and fought for their father's land. Moses graciously took it to the Lord, as Moses always does. And the Lord was merciful and provided a new law for the girls. Then Moses and God met on the mountain to take a sneak peek of the promised land and did a little succession planning while they were up there. Joshua was named the next leader of Israel. And then last, God commanded the new generation to keep all the holy days and then provides a calendar, a list of when and how they were to make these offerings.
All right, chapter 30, God is going to outline some interesting details on vows to God. A vow is a promise to God. And we most recently discussed vows in number 6 when we read about the rules for taking a vow to be a Nazirite. Now, most often, a vow was made by an Israelite during a critical time in their life. It could be a simple prayer like, "Dear God, if you help me with blank, I will blank."
Who hasn't made one of those kind of deals with God?
Exactly. We still do. It usually took the form of a promise to give God something or sacrifice something or a pledge to abstain from something. As simple as the prayer may be, keeping the vow could be complicated or difficult. An example of one of these in the Bible would be Hannah in 1 Samuel. Hannah struggled with infertility. She prayed to God and made a vow that if God gave her a son, she would give him up to serve the Lord for his whole life. And this was very difficult for her. She gave up Samuel around the age of 3. Now, a vow was a binding agreement with God, which led to problems because what if you didn't or couldn't keep a vow? One problem with vows is that people make promises in a crisis. And once the crisis is over, the vow gets overlooked or forgotten. Another problem was that sometimes you really couldn't keep the vow. But because a vow was binding and because it could be difficult to keep, more problems arose when women made vows that could impact their families. And so God addressed what to do if a woman must break a vow. Now note, because this section closely follows the story of Zelophehad's daughters, some commentaries pointed out that these 2 chapters represent a gradual shifting from patriarchy to a more equal relationship between women and men.
Well, that is an interesting perspective because I don't think it also continued all the way through the Bible, because we certainly see later that there was still a very patriarchal attitude towards women.
But that was the Jews' attitude, not God's. So these 2 stories are coming from God, and in both of them, what God tells them to do is to give the women more equal rights. Okay, first, we're going to discuss a vow made by a man.
Moses said to the heads of the tribes of Israel, "This is what the Lord commands. When a man makes a vow to the Lord or takes an oath to obligate himself by a pledge, he must not break his word, but must do everything he said."
For men, vows are unbreakable, period. No excuse. Okay. Unmarried girls living at home who make a vow.
Chapter 30, verse 3. When a young woman still living in her father's household makes a vow to the Lord or obligates herself by a pledge, and her father hears about her vow or pledge, but says nothing to her, then all her vows and every pledge by which she has obligated herself will stand. But if her father forbids her when he hears about it, none of her vows or pledges by which she obligated herself will stand. The Lord will release her because her father has forbidden her.
If a woman is a young single woman living with her father can void her vow. Because she is dependent on her father, the vow could impact him. If her father hears about the vow and says nothing, it will be binding. But if her father objects to the vow, God will forgive her for not fulfilling it. Here's the rules for unmarried girls living at home who then marry.
Verse 6. If she marries after she makes the vow, or after her lips utter a rash promise by which she obligates herself and her husband hears about it, but says nothing to her, then her vows or pledges by which she obliged herself will stand. But if her husband forbids her, when he hears about it, he nullifies the vow that obligates her or the rash promise by which she obligates herself, and the Lord will release her.
If a woman makes a vow when single and then marries, her husband can void her vow. Her dependency passes from her father to her husband. Therefore, the vow can impact her husband now. If her husband objects to the vow, God will forgive her for not fulfilling it. If he hears of the vow and says nothing, the vow will stand. Moving on to widowed and divorced women.
Verse 9, any vow or obligation taken by a widow or divorced woman will be binding on her.
So, like the men's rules for the vow where it stands, as a widow or divorcee, a woman would not necessarily be under the protection of her father, and she's no longer under the protection of a husband, and therefore would be held accountable to keep her vow because her vow impacts nobody but her. Okay, here are the rules for married women.
Verse 10, if a woman living with her husband makes a vow or obligates herself by pledge or oath, and her husband hears about it but says nothing to her and does not forbid her, then all her vows or the pledges by which she obligated herself will stand. But if her husband nullifies them when he hears about them, then none of the vows or pledges that come from her lips will stand. Her husband has nullified them, and the Lord will release her. Her husband may confirm or nullify any vow she makes or any sworn pledge to deny herself. But if her husband says nothing to her about it from day to day, then he confirms all her vows or the pledges binding on her. He confirms them by saying nothing to her when he hears about them. If, however, he nullifies them sometime after he hears about them, then he must bear the consequences of her wrongdoing.
If a woman is married, her husband can void her vow. If her husband hears about the vow and says nothing, it will remain binding. If her husband objects to the vow, God will forgive her for not filling it. Now, I do think this is funny that the most common example given for this ruling was that women sometimes took vows of abstinence. Their husbands didn't like that.
Yeah, that's not going to work.
Yeah. So, if a wife takes a vow of abstinence, this would affect the husband equally because A, they're not going to fulfill their command to be fruitful and multiply, and he may,
not like
then be
that.
Distracted and tempted to go to somebody else.
Verse 16, these are the regulations the Lord gave Moses concerning relationships between a man and his wife and between a father and his young daughter still living at home.
Well, as Heather said, we still make vows today, and here are some considerations for vows that we can learn because there's some important principles that we can apply to making promises to God. First, promises made to God are serious. If you're in a time of crisis and you make a vow, don't be rash and make a dumb vow. Think about it and make a true vow.
That you could potentially keep.
Not potentially. You need to keep it.
Yeah, you need to keep it.
The effects of our vows, here's the second thing to remember before you make a vow. The effects of our vows on other people should be considered before we make them. For example, if you have 3 kids and make a vow to fast for a week, does your husband or mom who helps you or nanny have the capacity to cover for you if you become incapacitated? Because I can tell you if I fasted for a week, I wouldn't be able to do anything by day 3. Third thing, those who commit to support someone else in their vow should not be fickle. So if your spouse commits to a vow and you agree that he should make the vow, then you should support him in it no matter how hard it gets. Don't all of a sudden go, well, I want you to renege on that vow because I don't like it. Okay, moving on to chapter 31. This is the story of the battle against the Midianites. Now, who are the Midianites? Well, if you've been with us for a while, you've heard this name before because the Midianites have played a role, both good and bad, in our story since Genesis. The Midianites were people descended from Abraham by his second wife, Keturah. Yes, he had another wife after Sarah. Go back and listen. Whose fourth son, so Keturah's fourth son, and Abraham was still producing sons at the ripe old age of over 100. Fourth son was named Midian. The Midianites were a large group and often mixed it up with other smaller tribes, such as the Ishmaelites. Remember that name? They were descendants of Abraham through Sarah's maid. The Moabites, related to Abraham through his nephew Lot, who chose to live in Sodom and ended up creating the Moabite tribe through an incestuous relationship with his daughter. and the Amalekites, descendants also of Abraham through Isaac, who had twins, Jacob and Esau. Amalek was Esau's grandson.
I think I see where you're going with this because all of those that you just mentioned are all thorns in the Israelites' sides.
Correct, but they're all descendants from people we know. And particularly, you hear the repetitive word in there, Abraham, Abraham, Abraham. Now, remember, not everybody who is either a cousin, a nephew of Abraham, or a descendant of Abraham was an Israelite. Israelites were one line chosen as from the descendants of Abraham. The Midianites, in particular, were nomads who roamed the areas around Canaan in the regions of Sinai, the Negev, and Transjordan. The Midianites were not Canaanites. The Canaanites were descendants of Noah's son Ham. Remember, Noah was way before Abraham. Abraham and his offspring, including Israel and the Midianites, were descendants of Noah's son Shem. Oh my goodness, we have maps of this territory. Remember, Noah is the first, gets off the boat. It's only he and his family left alive, and his 3 sons spread out into 3 different groups of people, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And Shem becomes the chosen line that produces Abraham, and Ham becomes the line that becomes the Canaanites. Okay, why should the Israelites fight the Midianites if they are not Canaanites? Because remember, it's the Canaanites who live in the Promised Land. Up until now, there have been a few good Midianites in Moses' life. His wife, Zipporah, his father-in-law, Jethro, and his brother-in-law all helped Moses at one time. Good Midianites, they were familiar with God because, of course, they came from Abraham, so they'd all heard about God. However, in Numbers 25, Balaam gave the Moabites, not the Midianites, an idea to defeat Israel. Balaam said, seduce Israel away from God by tempting them to worship other gods, specifically the fertility god Baal of Peor, who was worshipped with temple prostitutes. Apparently, the Midianites were in on the Moabites' plan because the prostitute priestess Cosby, who actually gained access into the Israelite camp and was speared in the act, was a Midianite, not a Moabite. So the plan was given by Balaam to the Moabites, but the Midianites were in on it because, like I said, the Midianites, the Moabites, the Amalekites, they all mixed it up. The outcome for the Midianites' sin against Israel was not good. God decreed in Numbers 25 that the Israelites were to, verse 17, treat the Midianites as enemies and kill them. They treated you as enemies when they deceived you in the Peor incident involving their sister Cosby, the daughter of a Midianite leader, the woman who was killed. So here's the story of the revenge on the Midianites.
Chapter 31. The Lord said to Moses, take vengeance on the Midianites for the Israelites. After that, you will be gathered to your people. So Moses said to the people, arm some of your men to go to war against the Midianites so that they may carry out the Lord's vengeance on them. Send into battle 1,000 men from each of the tribes of Israel. So 12,000 men armed for battle, 1,000 from each tribe, were supplied from the clans of Israel. Moses sent them into battle, 1,000 from each tribe, along with Phinehas, son of Eleazar the priest, who took with him articles from the sanctuary and the trumpets for signaling.
This is the second episode in a row where God gives Moses another little reminder that his time is coming to be gathered to his people. I wish I knew how Moses felt about these little reminders. Either it made him sad because he wouldn't live to see the promised land, or possibly he was relieved because he was exhausted from the burden of leading 2 million crazy people. In any case, Moses clearly knew he would not have the opportunity to lead Israel in the wars against Canaan. But God gave him this last victory and chance to put an end to the people who had so destructively threatened his people. Remember, 20-some thousand men were killed from the plague because of this Zimri Cosby act of what we think was sex right in the middle of the camp. Now, the fact that Phinehas is sent with the soldiers into this war indicates that this is a holy war. And we know Phinehas has a really good arm with a spear because he can kebab two people at one time. Phinehas had been the priest that speared the Israelite Zimri and the Midianite woman Cosbi for defiling the camp. Here's where the Midianites meet their maker.
Verse 7, they fought against Midian as the Lord commanded Moses and killed every man. Among their victims were Evi, Rechem, Zor, Hor, and Reba, the 5 kings of Midian. They also killed Balaam, son of Beor, with the sword.
The battle outcome for Midian was severe. Every single man, including 5 kings and the greedy, faithless Balaam, who just happened to be still in the area, are killed. One of the kings, Zur, was Cosbi's father, confirming that she was very high up as a Midianite priestess / princess of paganism. Additionally, because Balaam was still in Moab, it is thought that he had become some type advisor to these kings. We are not surprised, as we know Balaam would do anything for a shekel. The men have been killed, but what is to become of the women, the children, and the spoils from this battle? Here is the plunder problem.
Verse 9. The Israelites captured the Midianite women and children and took all the Midianite herds, flocks, and goods as plunder. They burned all the towns where the Midianites had settled, as well as all their camps. They took all the plunder and spoils, including the people and animals, and brought the captive spoils and plunder to Moses and Eleazar the priest and the Israelite assembly at their camp on the plains of Moab by the Jordan across from Jericho.
Now, when we get into Joshua and beyond, we're going to discover that there is a future pattern for Canaanite plunder. And it is different than in this conquest because this was not the promised land. The cities of Midian were burned so that the Israelites would not be tempted to live there because they're supposed to go live in Canaan. The sparing of women and children was an act of mercy, the commentaries think, but that would not be acceptable in Canaan, but could in other situations be acceptable. But Moses thinks not in this situation.
And that's because God had already commanded them whenever you win a battle like this, you're to kill everyone, not to... God had told them.
In Canaan.
But this wasn't Canaan.
This was in Canaan. So in some situations, it was okay to show mercy, but Moses thinks not in this situation, if you'll keep reading.
Verse 13, Moses, Eleazar the priest, and all the leaders of the community went to meet them outside the camp. Moses was angry with the officers of the army, the commanders of thousands and commanders of hundreds who returned from the battle. Have you allowed all the women to live, he asked them. They were the ones who followed Balaam's advice and enticed the Israelites to be unfaithful to the Lord in the Peor incident, so that a plague struck the Lord's people. Now, kill all the boys and kill every woman who has slept with a man, but save for yourselves every girl who has never slept with a man.
This is our sweet, compassionate Moses speaking here, and he has good reason. I imagine that Moses and Eleazar, who's now the high priest, had runners who kept them informed of everything that happened in the battle, going back and forth like, this is what's happening. So, of course, they knew what was happening and who was approaching as the battle was over and with what the soldiers were approaching the camp with. And Moses was not happy for good reason.
I think probably, too, how you've already talked about how Moses takes everything to God. In the last episode, we talked about that. So if they were running back information, Moses had probably already consulted God about this. And he knew how to react in this situation.
And when you hear it, it's going to make common sense. The soldiers were bringing all the Midianite women with them. These very same women were the ones that Balaam had used to seduce the Israelite men, which had resulted in the plague that had killed thousands of Israelites. Last time, one of the women came into the camp. She went straight into the tent with a man. That was Cosbi. And now they wanted to bring all the Midianite women into the camp. Perhaps saving the women wasn't an act of mercy on the part of these soldiers. Perhaps the men had other things on their mind, which is exactly Moses' point of concern. They were a temptation. They were going to lead them into, sexual worship of a fertility god. Moses is super firm with them. Boys and any woman not a virgin must be put to death. Now, young women, which were probably very young girls, would be spared. But the harshness of the entire scene is not softened by this one concession for these girls because, yes, thousands of girls are spared, but they are now orphans. They have lost their fathers and their mothers. I read a verse in our last episode, and I'm going to summarize it here. God's ways are not our ways. And in these biblical times, the only way to understand harshness such as this is to realize that what was at stake at this time in history was so important to the worship of God. This is not just another story of sin and rebellion. It was a threat to the nation of Israel as a whole. This same type of evil threat, the worshiping of other gods, will eventually destroy both the Israelite kingdoms when they do not execute the Canaanites as ruthlessly as God commands. There is a harsh but divine judgment for any nation that is a threat to the existence of God's people. Well, with all the death and blood from this battle, the Israelites need a post-war purification.
Verse 19. Anyone who has killed someone or touched someone who is killed must stay outside the camp 7 days. On the 3rd and 7th days, you must purify yourselves and your captives. Purify every garment as well as everything made of leather, goat hair, or wood. Then Eleazar the priest said to the soldiers who had gone into battle, "This is what is required by the law that the Lord gave Moses. Gold, silver, bronze, iron, tin, lead, and anything else that can withstand fire must be put through the fire, and then it will be clean. But it must also be purified with the water of cleansing, and whatever cannot withstand fire must be put through the water. On the 7th day, wash your clothes and you will be clean. Then you may come into the camp."
As outlined in Season 3 of Bible Book Club, 7 days is needed for the purification from contact with a dead body. Also outlined is the purification of the treasure. Now, this is a great contrast to when they came out of Egypt. They didn't have to do any of these things. But again, because they are having a relationship with God in the tabernacle, his environment has to be pure. And so they do have these processes. And Leviticus is such a great explanation of all this. So next, God is going to outline how to divide the plunder, starting with the soldiers' spoils.
Verse 25, the Lord said to Moses, "You and Eleazar the priest and the family heads of the community are to count all the people and animals that were captured. Divide the spoils equally between the soldiers who took part in the battle and the rest of the community. From the soldiers who fought in the battle, set apart as tribute for the Lord 1 out of every 500, whether people, cattle, donkeys, or sheep. Take this tribute from their half share and give it to Eleazar the priest as the Lord's part. From the Israelites' half, select 1 out of every 50, whether people, cattle, donkeys, or sheep, or other animals. Give them to the Levites, who are responsible for the care of the Lord's tabernacle." So Moses and Eleazar the priest did as the Lord commanded Moses. The plunder remaining from the spoils that the soldiers took was 675,000 sheep, 72,000 cattle, 61,000 donkeys, and 32,000 women who had never slept with a man. The half share of those who fought in the battle was 337,500 sheep, of which the tribute for the Lord was 675, 36,000 cattle, of which the tribute for the Lord was 72, 30,500 donkeys, of which the tribute for the Lord was 61, 16,000 people, of whom the tribute for the Lord was 32. Moses gave the tribute to Eleazar the priest as the Lord's part, as the Lord commanded Moses. The half belonging to the Israelites, which Moses set apart, that of the fighting men, the community's half, was 337,500 sheep, 36,000 cattle, 30,500 donkeys, and 16,000 people. From the Israelites' half, Moses selected 1 out of every 50 people and animals as the Lord commanded him and gave them to the Levites, who were responsible for the care of the Lord's tabernacle.
The book of Numbers is a book that loves numbers.
Oh, yes, it does.
In this plunder list, the numbers are staggering. 840,000 livestock total and 32,000 young girls. Half of the share of spoils went to the soldiers and half to the people. Now, the spoils are divided evenly between the soldiers and the people, but the distribution of those equal amounts would have been unequal within those two groups because there were a lot more people than soldiers. Does that make sense? Before they got their spoils, an amount of tax was taken for the Lord. The amount taken from the soldiers' half was 1/500th. The soldiers who had risked their lives gave a smaller share to the Lord because of their service to the Lord. This tax from the soldiers was given to the high priest Eleazar as a sacred offering. Now, the amount taken from the people was 1/50th, 10 times the tax on the soldiers. It was a lot higher. The tax from the people went to support the Levites. I love the just economy of all this.
Yeah, we call that a progressive tax, don't we?
Oh my gosh. Just the Lord was so thoughtful and equal the way he laid everything out for them, because of course they're going to use this as a model in the future. Now, the officers of this battle gave an extra share for the Lord.
Verse 48, then the officers who were over the units of the army, the commanders of thousands and commanders of hundreds, went to Moses and said to him, your servants have counted the soldiers under our command, and not one is missing. So we have brought as an offering to the Lord the gold articles each of us acquired, armlets, bracelets, signet rings, earrings, and necklaces to make atonement for ourselves before the Lord. Moses and Eleazar the priest accepted from them the gold, all crafted articles, all the gold from the commanders of thousands and commanders of hundreds that Moses and Eleazar presented as a gift to the Lord weighed 16,750 shekels. Each soldier had taken plunder for himself. Moses and Eleazar the priest accepted the gold from the commanders of thousands and commanders of hundreds and brought it into the tent of meeting as a memorial for the Israelites before the Lord.
This was a spontaneous extra gift to the Lord from the officers out of gratitude for the miracle that not one soldier had died in the battle. And personally, I think that the reason not one soldier had died is because this is Moses' last battle. And he's fought so many throughout the wilderness. He lost his entire group of friends. His generation died. And I have to wonder if God just gave this victory to him without losing one single person as a gift that, you know what, you brought them this far. They're going to go into the promised land and they're going to be fine.
And I think it's really special that those soldiers brought this last offering of their own accord.
Yeah.
It wasn't expected. It wasn't required by the law. It was just something that they knew that they needed to do as an act of worship to God. And so I have a question for the listeners. What kind of act of worship is God calling you to today as an extra sacrifice in your life? What's a club without friends? If you're enjoying the Bible Book Club, why don't you share it? And then you can say, Welcome to the club. New episodes drop every Monday, and get all episodes now on Amazon Music. As always, head over to susanme.com/Bible Book Club for show notes from today's episode. Bible Book Club is hosted by Susan Merrill and Heather Rubio, edited by Buck Buchanan, produced by Hayley Mawat.